And I'd like first of all, for having our Vice President of Public Outreach and Board Governance, like to have our Vice President of Public Outreach and Board Governance, Maria Bonneville,
Yes.
a woman of all trades. Please call the roll.
Oh, I did just call the roll, so we're
You
all
did?
good to go. Yes.
Okay. So the president, all right, that shall constitute that. And now I'd like to is there any comments from our chair, Jonathan? JT, do you have anything to say?
Just welcome to everybody again. This is a very important undertaking that this working group has in store here. So we really appreciate all of you participating and adding your considerable expertise to the overall discussion as we drive our way towards making sure that CIRM funded products are accessible and affordable to all parties in California. So thank you very much.
Thank you, JT. I want to welcome for his first meeting, Dr. Pat Levitt, who is Vice President of Saban, a dear friend of mine, Research Institute at the Children's Hospital. We're very happy, Pat, that you've taken the time to serve with us, to have your perspective from your vantage point. And again, my thank you for that hospital saving my son's life many years ago. So welcome to the working group, Pat.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that.
Nice to have you. I wanted to give a few opening remarks so that we're all on the same page, because I've had a very, very busy last 2 weeks. But first of all, I want to give a shout out to our dear member, Ted Goldstein, who just did a video for a number of cancer issues. And I want to, Ted, if you could just spend a minute to tell us what that video was about and maybe the hookup where we can see it ourselves.
Sure, I'll put the, I'll send around the URL. I was invited to give the keynote address at the ASCO Gastroenterology Conference. ASCO is the American Society of Clinical Oncologists, as I'm sure you all know. And this was just, they wanted to get a non-oncologist perspective on artificial intelligence and innovation. And the tie-in to CIRM is that one of the things that I think has marked innovation of the last decade or two has been the creation of many great and important platforms that allow many people to bring their intelligence and work together. And that includes, of course, my own work on computers and CIRM's great work in making stem cell a viable therapeutic platform. And so what the tie-in was just to help the GI oncologists, who mostly, of course, focus on things like colorectal cancer and such, to broaden their perspective. They have many therapies, but not very many yet going on in the arsenal. And I got to introduce a little bit about 47 and what was going on there, and the fact that not to look at stem cells so much as a radical change, but an extension of what they already do with blood banks, where they are already operating, live tissue centers. And I told them about some of the great clinical trials and had a lot of help from the folks at CIRM. Milan, thanks so much to you and your team, Abla and such. They're really just tremendous helpful. So what I would encourage all of you is to help go out and speak about what we're doing here. And I think that this is a great time to build the bonds to the therapeutic community. You are all many of you are clinicians, of course, but now I think it's a great time to broaden people's horizons.
Well, thank you so much, Ted, and thank you for that excellent work. And as a colon cancer survivor, I appreciate the research that you highlighted as a result. I think it's also important for us to be very clear about what our mandate is with this initiative language from Prop 14. And part of the issue but the major issue, that total health expenditures in the United States reached about 3.8 trillion in 2019. In August 2020, California's total health expenditures were an estimated 399.2 billion just in California in terms of health expenditures accounted for about 13.2% of the state's gross domestic product, which at that point for California is about 3.1 trillion. As a result, the California per capita health care spending in 2018 was about $10,086. A person who knows very well about those numbers is our governor. And he and I have had numerous conversations regarding affordability, as well as Jim Benedetti knows from Cover California, just where we are in terms of expenditures. As a result, the governor put for the second time in his budget the creation of an Office of Affordability. And that's in the budget language now for about 30 million in terms of expenditures. What happens is that language is in the budget, but in order for it to be implemented, there has to be a budget trailer bill, which will be introduced following the budget's support. The first step is in May, what we call the May revises, for the budget to be reviewed ostensibly by the legislature and legislative committees to see where certain items might be augmented, where certain items might be deleted. But as far as I can tell, the 30 million for the budget for that office is going to remain intact, and the trailer bill will include that amount as we move forward. But the second issue is that it is required to have a piece of legislation that'll actually authorize and implement this Office of Affordability. And my dear friend, who's a forensic dentist who represents Sonoma County in the Assembly, Dr. Wood, Jim Wood, has introduced that legislation, and it's called AB 1130. And I'll be sending each of you a copy of that legislation. It's quite extensive, but it basically would establish within OSHPAD, which is the Office of Healthcare Affordability, to analyze the healthcare market for cost trends and drivers of spending, very much what we're going to be doing in the next year. It also is tasked with developing data with informing policies for lower healthcare costs, for consumers set and enforced cost targets, and create a state strategy for controlling the cost of healthcare and ensuring affordability. Healthcare cost containment is not new. I introduced the first bill in the 1970s unsuccessfully, and then John Garamendi and Bill Lockyer, then all of us in the Senate introduced a single payer initiative, which of course was vetoed. And now we just found out this past week that another attempt to create a single payer in California also failed in the Assembly, but apparently is going to be resuscitated. This bill would establish a statewide healthcare target for total and per capita healthcare expenditures by 2024. That's their goal. And by 2024 calendar, and specific targets for healthcare sector, including the fully integrated delivery system, geographic regions, which we're going to be concentrating on in the year ahead, as well as other categories of individual healthcare costs and entities, and hopefully taking progressive actions against healthcare entities for failing to meet the cost targets. And that's one of the main opposition to this legislation, is the fact that they're going to create an agency which is actually going to go after those people who are not meeting cost targets, including corrective action plans, and also establishing administrative penalties. So you can see how controversial that is for the California Hospital Association and other organizations which are currently opposed to this legislation. The bill also requires the gathering of data, which is very important to all of us on this group, because data determines just where we go, what targets we initiate. And those are to be established by June 1st of 2025. The bill also would require the office to monitor cost trends and healthcare market accessibility issues, which of course we're going to be undertaking as well. I just wanted to give you an overview. The bill passed June 6th of 2021. And so it was assigned to the Senate, and the conversations I had with Senator Pan and the Senate Health Committee just this morning indicate that they are trying to set a hearing date earlier than June, hopefully sometime in March. And the author is moving ahead to have that hearing before the Senate Health Committee. So it should be a very interesting hearing. I'll report back to you what happens during that process. So if there are any questions you want to articulate to me, please be free to email me. I'll be happy to respond. Our next element in our agenda is to look at just a review of Prop 14 terms for the CIRM's royalty revenues, which is a very established achievement that we were, with the leadership of Dr. Milan, JT, Steve Julesgaard, and others, to negotiate with Stanford to bring these revenues from royalties into a fund which will hopefully help patients. Who's going to take that up? Is that you, Mark, or?
No, it's going to be, Jeff is going to
Oh,
give
okay.
a presentation on behalf of the team. Art,
Okay, for both those.
thank you so much.
Dr. Jeff Lomax, our Senior Science Officer, welcome to the group.
Thanks. Let me just see if I can get the screen here. Yep, looks good. Let me find, hang on one second. Just trying to find the presentation. There we go. Let's try again here. That's better. Let me get to the. Okay, you should have a full screen view, and I'm assuming you can hear me. For those of you I've not met, again, my name is Jeff Lomax. I'm the project manager for CIRM's clinical trials network, the Alpha Clinics. And in addition, I've supported Senator Torres and the CIRM leadership team by tracking regulatory and policy issues that impact CIRM's strategic plan. This afternoon, what I want to give you is a review of the Prop 14 terms with regard to royalty revenues. So a reminder, our mission, accelerating world-class science to deliver transformative regenerative medicine treatments in an equitable manner to a diverse California and the world. So this particular topic has incredible bearing on our ability to deliver those. So this is the language in the proposition, and the specific things I want to draw your attention to is that royalty revenues, again, they're deposited into the general fund. So that's significant, and that'll become apparent as I move through the presentation. And they're for the purpose of providing treatment and cures arising from CIRM-funded research to patients who have insufficient means to purchase such treatments or cures. So again, alluding to both potentially approved treatments in the future, but also including reimbursement of patient qualified costs for research participants. So presumably that's clinical research or clinical trials. So what I'm going to do is go through a series of sort of 3 questions that we have for you all today. We're not necessarily going to be answer all 3 questions, but I wanted to lay out the questions. And the first one is really comes in the form of a recommendation. And the recommendation from the CIRM team is that now that we have funds available, that we create what we're calling a CIRM Patient Assistance Fund. And so what I think I'd like to do, Senator Torres, is just go through the 3 points, and then you'll have discussion. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, question 1 is CIRM Patient Assistance Fund. We would need the recommendation of the AAWG that we move forward with such a fund. The second point is then to really understand the scope of the fund. We don't have specific recommendations today for the following 2 questions, but I would like to describe what the questions are. So the fund must be, if you're going to make an appropriation, it must be for a defined amount of money, so a dollar amount, and a defined purpose. And that purpose must be consistent with the enabling legislation. So in this case, I'm referring to Proposition 13. You saw the language previously, so it relates to the objective of providing assistance to patients who wouldn't otherwise have access. A couple of other things just to kind of give you a sense of time frame. To move forward, the earliest possible time we could release funds would be in fiscal year 23-24. So that's a year from this July. And another thing that's important is that the funds requested need to be spent in the fiscal year. So that requires some degree of forecasting. You want to get the numbers right. With our research funds, we can always roll them into additional years, but in this case, we're dealing with general fund amounts, so we need to have the ask done correctly. So the second set of questions are, again, confirming that we define the purpose and the amount of money. That's question 2. And in addition, we also need to consider how the assistance fund would be administered. And we've done a bit of research. We don't come forward today with any specific recommendation, but wanted to describe some of the possibilities that we know exist. You could consider working with an established patient assistance fund. There are numerous funds that exist currently, and that the fund could distribute funds on behalf of CIRM vis-a-vis an RFP mechanism where we would define a scope and how those funds could be used. Option 2 would be to create a new fund, sort of de novo, one that's, just create the CIRM Patient Assistance Fund. Again, typically we would use an RFA as the mechanism where we would lay out what we're looking for in terms of expectations and criteria, but we wouldn't be using any established organization. We would be essentially creating a new one, most likely. And then third option would be we could take advantage of CIRM's existing programs and deploy the funds through those programs. The most, I think the most obvious example might be, say, an existing CIRM clinical trial where, say, there's a interest or willingness or some opportunity to reach a broader patient population. The existing trial doesn't have sufficient funds to support that broader population, but funding could be deployed to cover those costs. So that's sort of, again, existing programs. And again, we're early stage in our research. We were looking at various models that could potentially be deployed in this case. There may be other opportunities that you all are aware of, or things that we need to look at that aren't reflected in this list. And again, we're available to look at those. Again, I want to get back to the timeline because, again, we're trying to come to you very early in the process and for the benefit of your thinking. So in quarter 21-22, back to the question 2 and 3, or question 2 in particular, consider the amount and purpose of the request. Those are important considerations. If in fact there is an interest in being able to deploy funds in July of 2023, we'd need to start the process of identifying the amount and purpose, and ideally getting that request to the full board for consideration in June of this year. The June date is fairly critical because then in July and August, that request needs to go to the Department of Finance, and we need to work with the department to get that into the proposed budget. That budget effectively gets approved in the beginning of 2023. There's some processes where things get worked out, and ultimately by quarter 2 of 2023, those funds then become available to be spent. So this, again, gives you a sense of timeline. We're here at this early stage, trying to, again, bringing a set of options to the working group for your consideration. And with that, I'd turn it back to you, Senator Torres.
All right. Any questions on Jeff's presentation thus far?
Art, Maria has her hand raised.
Yes, Maria Milan, doctor.
Thank you, Senator. I wanted to just kind of supplement what Jeff had presented, and thank you, Jeff. A couple of things. We wanted to make sure that the AAWG was aware that there's no specific timeline where these funds have to be expended. It's just that they're currently available. So the idea of setting laying out this timeline is to give an indication of the process that one would have to go through in order to access these funds. I think the most important topic is an understanding of what the AAWG feels that these funds that are earmarked for patient assistance, should it be used for. There are definitely models out there of patient assistance funds, et cetera, and that, that we have become familiar with. but there are also other ways that the CIRM using these funds could also support, the spirit of Prop 14 provision. So I just wanted to make sure that when our team stated that we recommend the AAWG to consider the patient assistance fund, it's not specifically we have any particular structure in mind or scope or anything. It's just so that we have a starting point from where to go. So I wanted to just, insert a little bit of clarity on that. And that funds, even if they're not expended for a given year, apparently I'm told by Maria Bonneville and Kevin Marks, who have been, as well as our Department of Finance, our Director of Finance, who's been in communication with the Department of Finance, these funds are earmarked for this purpose. So they should be still, protected for this particular use.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you, Jeff, again. I think, again, I want to reiterate how important it is for us to be ahead of the game here. People have been waiting patiently for years as to what kind of royalties the state would get back as a result of the research that the taxpayer have funded. And clearly, this is a vivid example that we were telling the truth in terms of where we're headed to in the future. So the first step, the first initial step is a recommendation by this group to our full board of CIRM so that they can adopt it formally. And that is, I will entertain a motion to recommend for consideration that this royalty fund be established and named the CIRM Patient Assistance Fund. How we implement it is going to be a continued conversation with the members of this working group, and therefore recommendations that we will make to our full board. But we initially have to start by establishing this through legislation, which will be done later. But first of all, the recommendation from this working group to create this fund in the first place.
So moved.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and second. Discussion.
Senator, this is Al Roulette. I don't know if you're
Al.
going in. Yes. So given that the need is established and certainly in keeping with what you said about the expectations that people have related to royalties, I would be interested in having staff come back to the committee with a presentation regarding what existing organizations that are doing this work in this space are doing now. And I say that because in my thinking that might indeed accelerate the timeline that's been presented here slightly so that we might be able to get money to patients sooner. I say that with some lack of understanding around the timeframes between Q1 2023 and July 2023 and what's going to be happening there. So I know there'll be more explanation about that. And then the second point is, if staff come back and provide us with a presentation, I assume that it is always operationally a lot more, it could be faster if an outside entity did this work for CIRM, but I don't know what all of the legal encumbrances are, or if it's necessary that the work be housed in CIRM. So I'd be interested in the presentation for that reason as well. And then all the questions about what's allowable costs and all those things, and that would be associated with a presentation like that would be helpful for me. My experience on the behavioral health side with supporting patients with participation in trials is slightly different. It's typically a third-party administrator that administers the funds and gets it to the patients to ensure that they can participate. And so in part, my questions are being informed by that experience as a patient advocate.
Well, you're right on target, because that's exactly what the two Marias and Jeff and I have been talking about in moving forward in this area. Number one, to establish a process whereby an RFP could be issued, but also to rely upon the members of this working group to give us their ideas or suggestions of groups that are out there that we may not know of that ought to be highlighted and directed with such an RFP. and also the type of assistance as articulated in the presentation by Dr. Lomax regarding an RFA, and also where funds could be expended in current CIRM programs that we think might be relevant. My own experience, and yours has been in the behavioral, my experience has been in the organ transplant field with One Legacy, where we've funded organizations, the AVA Foundation being one, which is a heart transplant foundation that helps patients have accessibility to organ transplants by paying for their expenses to come to Los Angeles, paying for their caregivers, so that they have an easy way to establish accessibility and affordability to those transplants. So you're right on target, Al, and we're going to be moving in that direction and anticipating any recommendations we might have from organizations that members of this group might have access to or might so recommend. Ms. Centille, you had your Dr. Centille, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Just wanted to bring a thought for discussion. I think it is wonderful that we have funds to support patients. But when we think about accessibility of care, particularly for this particular therapy, it is kind of limited to certain institutions, and patients do have to travel a long distance, as we have already seen. So some of the institutions lack infrastructure or certain research support to provide this type of therapy to patients. And will there be any consideration to use these funds to look at that accessible institutions that, if we support, could possibly offer this treatment to patients much more in their backyard, rather than patients having to travel a long distance to access certain trials and therapies? That's just a thought for discussion, because could this patient assistance fund be expanded to affect both the affordability and the accessibility, looking at it from a different point?
Well, given the language, and I helped draft this language for the initiative back in 2020, we always wanted to have flexibility in terms of how these funds were used. And Dr. Milan, I think you would agree, right, that this is an excellent suggestion that we could very well implement to make sure that people have the accessibility, which also comes back to the affordability, right, Maria?
Yes, absolutely. I think that another member has their hands up, I think.
Yes.
Senator Torres, I'd like to be able to, follow on to some of the topics brought up by Board Member Rowlett when there's an opportunity to do so.
Okay, Amar, I think you had your hand up. Welcome.
Thank you, Senator. This is really great step. My question is around in thinking around whether we should be seeking a third party or an established fund versus doing it ourselves. Is the patients going into this research, where are they coming from? Are they coming mainly from trials that the CIRM is running versus trials that maybe other companies are running? So what's the balance? If it's more on our side, maybe it's worth it to think about running such patient assistance ourselves. If they're coming from everywhere, then maybe we need more decentralization around making those funds available. That's thank you.
Thank you. Maria, did you want to respond? No one else has raised their hand.
This is a very meaty topic, so I'm going to try to approach this in a way that I hope will be helpful. I think that what Board Member Rowlett brought up is, third parties that potentially could come in and deploy, the use of these funds to help CIRM with the objective of making trials, currently probably just at the level of trials because we don't have approved therapies in our portfolio yet, accessible to patients from all communities. I think that's a very tangible, realistic, and doable thing. We have spoken to different funds such as the assistance TAF, the assistance fund, which is one of the biggest ones, and PAN. These are programs that are very highly experienced, are very aware of the regulatory, kind of requirements, have had discussions with the HHS in terms of what's allowable, non-allowable. I think it might be useful for this committee to hear a presentation from some of those programs, to gain a kind of an understanding for the types of programs they deploy and the reason for them. Because there are some restrictions from CMS in terms of what things one can provide and whatnot that go counter to what's allowable. Okay, so that's one piece, because even if we do deploy an RFP, I think it would be well informed. And again, not to make it, I think that if that is the direction as the first option that the AAWG wishes to consider, I think that in itself, gaining the information to go so that it gives us enough direction from the AAWG to work with, I think is an important next step. But the other options that Senator Torres mentioned that Jeff had also put up is that, we fund clinical trials. We fund clinical trials through our Clinical 2 program. And there are already some parts of the clinical trials and costs to patients who enroll that are uncovered costs are allowable costs that we can cover. But then in addition to that, there are other intangibles or other costs that don't fit squarely into what's covered through standard, coverage mechanisms or through our clinical trial policy. So there's that discrete category that speaks to the centralized model where CIRM as a funding agency could, the AAWG could recommend that be how the funds are expended in terms of supplementing the programs we already support. And so I wanted to bring up those two major kind of tangible options that already have, systems or models in place to work with.
All right. Well, thank you, Maria, and thank you again for the patience of this working group. As you know, we are, not to use a similar term, but we are on a very pioneering embryonic trajectory here. And the kinds of issues that we put forward we're really making history for this state and for patients. Maria Bonneville, you had your hand up earlier. I didn't want to ignore it. No. All right.
Nope, that's okay. Thank you.
All right. Anyone? All right, Dr. Thomas?
Yes, Art, just for the purposes of the working group, but Jeff, could you put up that the last page of the slide again, presentation again, please?
The timeline?
Yes. So question just for Art, Maria, and Jeff. The first item, consider amount and purpose of the request. When for the working group do we envision bringing potential proposals for those two topics to the group for its consideration?
Well, I think the first step is to pass this motion, which is on the table, to create this assistance fund, and that what emanates from that will be the discussion that you're referencing.
Okay, just are we looking to the working group to come up with the purposes, or are we going to be presenting some indicative purposes for consideration? How are we?
Well, my intent is for the working group to recommend to the full board, and the full board approve the establishment of this fund. And then, as Maria said, have more information from groups like PAM, TAF, and others to give us an idea and the breadth of jurisdiction that we need to implement in developing an RAF. But some of the issues that were raised by other members today also lead us in other directions that we need to talk about.
Okay, so the meeting of the working group post the March ICOC meeting adopting the motion here,
yes,
will be the one that we'll get into sort of the meat of that particular line item there.
Right, and also we'll continue our discussions, the two Marias and Jeff and I, in terms of just what that ought to look like, and whether or not we're looking at what kinds of RFAs or RFPs ought to be looked at to put out to the field generally, and again relying upon this wealth of experience that we have in this working group and the contacts that all of you have to give us ideas of what organizations ought to be put on that list to receive an RFP or an RFA would be helpful as well.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Ted has his hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ted, Dr. Goldstein.
So I think one of the question I have here is what are what sort of success metrics we should have, and I can think of 4 off the top of my head that, while not opposed to each other, do conflict. One is patient outcome. Another is clinical trial success. Another is clinical trial cost management, and another is equity for disadvantaged groups. And those 4, they, I think it may behoove us to sort of prioritize what are the highest success metrics we want, and I think equity is certainly top of my list, given the charter of the group. But I also think we have to work, we are here to shepherd CIRM trials and their success as well. But individual patients, right, in clinical care and is always, paramount to every one-to-one interaction the clinicians have. So I don't know how to reconcile these things, but I think if we can establish a set of success metrics that we're after, then we will come out with what we want.
Excellent point. Any other comments? I see no other hands up. Oh,
Just very quickly, Art,
Yeah.
I want to endorse what Dr. Goldstein said regarding success metrics, and certainly I would second what he identified as the priority, that metrics for diverse, underserved patient groups. And then after the vote, it would be helpful for me, and I don't know if we'll have time. What I appreciate about that last slide is that once we get approval from the Department of Finance, it takes a year for funds to actually become available to be distributed. And I might be misinterpreting that, but at least that's what I saw, and that was part of my question. So this slide says submit request to Department of Finance July of this year, and then in July of next year, funds are expended. So just to appreciate that is a 12-month period between the getting the funds and then the funds being expended. And my hope was that after we vote, and my hope is that everybody approves this, that we could accelerate that process.
Maria?
Just to further comment on that. So the budget process, as everyone knows, is a lengthy process, and this goes through that same budget process that the state undergoes every year. So we would begin talking to the Department of Finance about the request for these funds and what they were going to be used for early on. And because it's something new to the budget, there's just a form we need to fill out and conversations that would start. And so it does take roughly a year in order to get the money into the account ready for it to be deployed by CIRM. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit.
And any way that I can push these bureaucrats to move a little more rapidly, I'll be very happy to do. And you had your hand up.
Yeah, on the finance topic, I was just wondering if there's any flexibility in the language, Senator, that might allow us to talk with finance about the possibility of a revolving fund or a continuous appropriation that would give us a little bit more flexibility than the annual bind of an annual ask.
There's always that option, and I certainly would pursue it. And after talking to Maria Bonneville, because she has been dealing mostly over the years with the Department of Finance, as has JT. So there are options out there. The other problem is that for this Office of Affordability, which the governor is proposing in the current budget for 30 million, would not take effect until January 1, 2023, because the legislation wouldn't take effect till then unless it were an urgency clause. And they're reluctant to do that because the opposition just wouldn't allow for a 2/3 vote to pass easily. So there are a number of other variables that are there, which I'm maneuvering through as we begin this budget process, because the subcommittees haven't even begun, I don't think, at least to have preliminary hearings on the budget process. Each house has an appropriation or a budget committee, and each budget committee has 4 or 5 subcommittees assigned to the various jurisdictions of state agencies that come under their review. And that obviously, as Maria said, takes time. But I think that we just have to explore it, every other option, as you said, Anne, that we might have to us, and then go from there. And I'll certainly be doing that. Thank you. Any other comments? All right, Maria, call the roll.
Dan Bernal,
Aye.
Ann Boynton,
Aye.
James DeBenedetti,
Aye.
Dana Dornsife, Dana Goldman, Ted Goldstein,
Aye.
David Higgins,
Yes.
Harlan Levine,
Aye.
Pat Levitt,
Yes.
Adriana Padilla,
Yes.
Amar Kadan,
Aye.
Al Rolette,
Aye.
David Serrano Sewell, Mahaswari Senthil, Adrian Shapiro,
Aye.
Jonathan Thomas,
Yes.
Art Torres.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, the motion carries, and we'll send that immediately over to the board, since our chair is here, so he knows it's coming for an approval at our next board meeting, which is when in March, Maria?
I believe the 24th.
Okay.
Yes, the 24th.
Right. And in between that time, Dr. Lomax and Dr. Milan and Maria and I will be having putting our heads together in terms of some of the issues that were raised by many of you on this call, because there were important issues to take into consideration as we move forward. All right. Next steps. I think we've pretty much exhausted that. Are there any other issues, Dr. JT?
Yeah, just a question, Art. This money that we're receiving for the 15+ million, since we know that it's going to be there, it's already identified, and therefore is in a bit of a different category than other funds that might be subject to budget considerations in the normal course. Is there any conceivable way that, because the money is already there and identified, that were we to come up with a request for that it could be considered for deployment any sooner than a year from this July?
Yes, I think Ann and I talked about that earlier, and that I will do everything I can to at least have the options available to us and report back to this working group.
Okay, I wasn't aware that was I think that's a great suggestion, because I do think this is an unusual pot of money in its source, and the fact that it is already there ready to be used if we were to ask. So I think that the extent we can avoid and pull a year's delay on utilizing it, that would be great, obviously.
Well, that's the concern also of the governor's office, who I was in touch with last week, talking to their point people on this Office of Affordability, and how they were unaware of what provisions we had in Proposition 14. So I educated them on that, and I think there's a consistency there to hopefully work together to make this happen. And I know the governor is very not concerned, but is very supportive of making sure this thing works out as well.
Thank you.
Any other comments or input? All right, I promise to make these meetings as brief as possible and productive as possible. So again, I want to thank you for the time each of you have provided to us on this agenda, and we will be back to you. Meeting is adjourned.